Word document at this stage. But yeah, I thought I would just quickly go through some of the content so people have like some of an idea of what's in it. And then there was a question earlier about some of the shifts that took place within SACID, which I thought was a really interesting question. And I'm going to read a section from one of the appendices that speaks to that, and why I think this publication is important. So there's a short introduction that I've written, which is just about 6 pages. And then Marcus's first chapter is on adult education and LACOM in South Africa. And he asked the question of why a study of LACOM, and the idea of doing a case study. And he locates the whole study within thinking about the role of service organizations or NGOs in South Africa within the framework of the liberation struggle. And then in terms of methodology, he writes about that in chapter 2, and uses participant observation and interviews, documentation, and his own memory from working in LACOM. And I think that's part of why the study is so interesting, because Marcus is writing it from his own experience, and speaking with and interviewing comrades as part of the research process. And then Marcus kind of separates the lifespan of LACOM into 2 phases. He speaks about the foundation phase, the formation and approach of SACID and LACOM. So he speaks about that as from like 81 to 84. And that constitutes chapter 3. And he looks at the various programs in SACID, well, in LACOM nationally, and then in the Western Cape. And in chapter 4, he looks at the development phase of LACOM from 85 to 88. And one of the things in there, he looks at all of the different publications that LACOM produced, which was quite substantial, particularly in that period. And then as a conclusion chapter where he thinks about really this question of, I mean, one of the questions I think you were grappling with, Marcus, at that time, it seems from the writing, is what is the role, or where do you place a political education project that is interested in and committed to the project of socialism, and how does that relate to a service organization that is externally funded? So I think that's a really interesting question that Marcus was grappling with then, and I think that's a question that many of us are grappling with in different ways now. And I was just going to read one little bit from it. Do I have some time? 2 minutes, okay. So one of the things we decided to do is include some of the unfinished notes as appendices in the project, so you can kind of see where, and those are some of the most interesting bits and pieces to my mind. I'm going to read a little bit from April 1996. Chapter 4. During April 1996, I intend working on Chapter 4, which covers the period of January 89 to December 1990, towards disbanding. This was a very difficult period within SACID. Within the country, there was a realization that change was on the horizon and that education also had to change to meet the new situation. Within the organization, the tensions that were manifest outside were beginning to impact on the organization. Worker education programs were at the crossroads, and a fierce battle ensued within LACOM and SACID about the direction that worker education programs should be taking and or guided along. At times, even those involved in these battles were not themselves fully aware of the underlying causes of some of the tensions. Many of the reasons only became clear later on. The section, the section on internal democracy deals with how the culture and structure of LACOM and SACID were changing, increasingly becoming bureaucratized and increasingly forcing or being forced by design and subconsciously the changes that were slowly but surely undermining the worker content and focus of Sackett's work in general, and Lacob's work in particular, to what was by now fast becoming an accommodation to the emerging reform process. Worker education programs were increasingly being used to prepare the working class and its organizations for the negotiations process that were planned. Instead of strengthening the working class and its organizations for this process, they were weakening them. So I think some of this is the most interesting part of the project to me, because Marcus is really thinking about, I guess, the process of demobilization that happens in the late 80s and the early 90s, and how that kind of comes through at different levels. And in the early 90s or mid 90s, when you're doing this project, I think it's an interesting time to be thinking through these questions. And I would recommend everyone reads this. And congratulations to Marcus for having a publication on Lacob.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is a good example of what Noor was talking about earlier, about documenting within movements. And at the time, it's so different to read this thesis that was written about the 80s, but in the mid 1990s, and then to read it now. So I hope your appetites are whetted to go and check it out, read it, and come chat to Marcus about it after that for some feedback, or what did you say? Not a critique, observations. Okay, so we're gonna move now to Asher's PhD thesis about the Yu Chi Chan Club and the NLF. Noor's gonna start us off with a bit of an introduction. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Connie. Great. So I think you all know Asher, and Connie did introduce him as a musician sometimes. Asher was also, is this working? I don't know, it doesn't matter. Asher was also very heavily involved in Rhodes Must Fall and Feast Must Fall. And this is important because when Asher approached me about the PhD, there were sort of three words that kind of stuck in my head. It was John Coltrane, Neville Alexander, and ensemble. And so I thought, here's someone from Rhodes Must Fall, a musician. This is going to be a thesis that's going to turn the Yu Chi Chan Club and the National Liberation Front into the Beatles. And I'm going to have to spend the next 3.5, 4 years having to deal with a Rhodes Must Fall student, Feast Must Fall student, trying to persuade me to think about the Yu Chi Chan Club as a band. As it turns out, it was a little bit more than this. And I want to kind of emphasize maybe just very quickly 3 or 4 strands. The idea of the ensemble is really critically important. I hope that when Asher speaks, that he'll say something about that, because it's really important. And you know, the thesis does many things, and it's very layered, it's very rich, but it sort of brings together in conceptually rich ways the way that many individuals, including Marcus and other people who've been spoken about during the course of today, at the moment in our history that has not been given the kind of attention which I think it deserves. So even though this thesis is about the Yu Chi Chan Club, about the National Liberation Front, it also is one of the first theses that in fact sheds important light on a moment in our history that until recently has only been rendered comprehensible through the lens of the history of the ANC. Of the mass movements in the 1950s and then the Sharpeville massacre. What happens in this thesis, it kind of opens up a really important part of what we spoke about, and I'm going to turn this way, about the left, right? Because it was a young left who found themselves in different ways in the late 1950s. And what the thesis does over a number of decades is that it traces organizations, but the organizations are almost, in my mind, incidental. They an expression of the way that people coalesced the decisions they took about the kind of form that they needed at a particular conjuncture. But what the ensemble does is it tells us about how people coalesce, how they got together, and very importantly, the ideas that they developed in practice, in struggle, but very importantly, through continuous studying, continuous thinking about what the nature of the struggle is. And so this period of the late 1950s is really critically important. And there's another moment in the late 1970s that this sort of ensemble plays a very similar role. And that's about trying to make sense of the world, trying to make sense of the politics, theorizing, trying to find one another, trying to understand what was necessary to execute a successful revolution in the country. And a lot of the focus initially was about the armed struggle and trying to make sense of the armed struggle, not only in the context of South Africa, but drawing on international experience. And that international experience was not a kind of a theorizing. It became part of the DNA, so that the ensemble sort of worked through these different kind of ideological, organizational, spatial registers that one needs to kind of make sense of. So what is, and I know I'm running out of time. Okay. By the way, I've read this thesis about 100 times, so I can go on for about 2 hours about it. Okay. But let me just make kind of two points, because this is not my thesis. Asher needs to speak about it. Is the personal is political. And I'm going to urge you to read this, because there are some really juicy details, okay? And the political is personal, and the personal is political. This ensemble would not have worked if it wasn't for the kind of personal connections. And of course, there were love affairs, there were breakups, there were all the kinds of things that make movements, but which we often don't insert into our understanding of movements, because we think there's a division between something called the political and something else called the personal. And what this thesis does brilliantly is to show how over many decades the personal was profoundly important, and it shaped the practice, it shaped the ideas, and it shaped the way that people studied, the way they were able to relate to one another, and very crucially how caring for one another was so fundamental. And that's the point that Lydia was making, right? How fundamental the idea of caring for one another was profoundly important in determining your politics. That without that, you can't build, because then you are not building a real movement. You're building a movement that's eviscerated of the kind of caring, the personal dimensions that is so fundamental to revolution. My final point is that, no, my penultimate point, okay? I can hear some people complaining because I've heard this 100 times, okay? So this is my penultimate point, okay? And that is the other moment in which the ensemble becomes really important is in the late 70s, early 1980s. And I think that when we try to answer the question that people asked earlier about imagining a new movement, reimagining the left, it's really crucially important that we return to those moments where people like this ensemble, like the Yuchi-chan Club, in fact, paid attention, read, thought, debated, questioned one another very deeply about where we were. What was the nature of the conjuncture? What was the nature of the revolution? What did we have to do? And what the thesis does is to show how people evolved, how the ideas evolved, even though the kind of overarching objectives remain quite similar. And that was about emancipation, because the kind of emancipation we want has not changed fundamentally, but the road to that has shifted over time. My final point is really, really quick. And that is, this is a thesis which has been read by myself 100 times. It's been read by 3 other people, actually 4 other people, okay? 3 examiners and 1 other person who's also read it very carefully. And so I'm urging all of us to apply collective pressure on this man, Dr. Asher Gametse, to make sure that this thesis doesn't stay and collect virtual dust on Wits University's website, but he actually puts in the effort to publish it as a book. as soon as possible, because I think it deserves to be. Thanks.
Thank you. I now know that penultimate and final are not the same thing. Asher, over to you.
Thanks, Noah. Yeah, appreciate your supervision and the careful and kind way that you laid it all out there. Probably better than I could have done. So I'm going to take a bit of a different approach. But I think, it was in the beginning of the day today. We had a memorial for some of those who have passed, in the last year, and two of those people were Frank van der Horst and Elizabeth van der Hayden, and those were two people who were involved with the ensemble of people that were part of the ensemble, essentially, that I write about from the late 50s, and I really, so two people that I had some conversations with and interviews with in the process of doing this project. I think the sense of like this, this history being urgent was really the reason that I did this project, because Marcus and a few others are the only ones really left around, and I'm really glad that I got to speak to Frank van der Horst and Elizabeth van der Hayden, because, the project wouldn't be possible in the way that I've done it after this moment. So I want to say thank you to them for their time, and I wish they were here to read the dissertation. And I would love to hear the critiques of it, of which I'm sure there are many. But I'll leave that to everyone else. But I really started this project, or did this project, because I kept hearing about the Uchi Chan Club. And it was this kind of like vague, mysterious, like almost conspiracy theory-esque story, until I started to read a bit more, and had some conversations with Marcus and with Ottilie Abrams and with Elizabeth van der Hayden, and everyone would speak about the Uchi Chan Club. So it was like, okay, no, this thing is actually real, it was real. What really drew me to it was the sense I got from all of the people I spoke to who were involved in it, was that it was this really important experience in their lives. So all of these people that we spoke to, Ottilie, Marcus, Elizabeth, and some of the interviews with others that I've read, everyone would speak about the Uchi Chan Club almost as a touchstone, or like a very very deep experience. And the interesting thing about the Uchi Chan Club was that it lasted 9 to 12 months. So it was, for those who don't know, it was a reading group started in late 61 by a ragtag group of young radicals such as Marcus and Neville and Ottilie Abrams and Kenneth Abrams and Figile Bam and Elizabeth van der Hayden and a number of other people. And they got together to read about guerrilla warfare as a way to learn about strategies and histories of techniques of overthrowing a technologically superior military power. And the interesting thing about the Uchi Chan Club, or there's many interesting things about the Uchi Chan Club, but the other interesting thing about it was that it was an important experience in these people's lives who were involved in radically committed experiments for their whole lives. So, I remember speaking to some of Ottilie Abrams' family members and some comrades in Namibia, and they were saying that, you know, in the weeks before she passed away, and she was in hospital, she was trying to organize meetings from her bed in hospital. So and she kind of worked full time at the school that independent school that they founded in Windhoek, right up until she was too ill to. And Marcus, as we know, has kind of been involved with the Children's Resource Center for the last 40 years and continues to organize. And so I was really interested in what is this experience of the Uchi Chan Club, this intense experience of reading and learning together, and then founding the National Liberation Front, which was this organization intended to overthrow the apartheid state. What is the importance of that within this long political trajectory and these long political lives that people had? And how do we make sense of that in the absence of like one organization that these people belong to for all this time? You know, because all of these people were involved in multiple different organizations. They started a number of different experiments, community projects, reading groups, underground formations. And so in the process of looking at this history, I came to this idea of the ensemble, because I was trying to make sense of what is this thread over time that holds not only the people together, but also a politics together. And I like music, and I like thinking about music. And this idea of the ensemble is an interesting thing to me, because an ensemble, a particular band at a certain moment can create and develop a particular kind of sound that has an influence on whatever else is going on around it. But it's a very loose kind of formation, you know, like people can come in and come out. But an ensemble's kind of reverberation is further than the moment of its existence. And so I was interested in this idea of ensemble, which is a way that people were doing politics together. It was a way that people were doing life together. Marcus was speaking about in the experience of the Cape Peninsula Students Union. They would walk up the mountain and have weekends together up on Table Mountain. People would take guitars, and I think people might have been drinking. But that's something Marcus always emphasized to me, that it was a broad thing. It was an emotional thing as well as a political thing. It was about falling in love with people. It was about having radical teachers. It was about a whole range of things, kind of getting to know what was going on in the world. And so the ensemble became an idea that allowed things to come in and out in a kind of fluid way. One could be friends, comrades, lovers, siblings, neighbors. I mean, maybe not all of those at the same time, but but certain ones for sure. So it was about a way of doing politics. It was a way of holding together, a way of speaking, a way of studying. And yeah, I don't know how much time I have left. Probably not much. I have 2 minutes. Okay. I think I can maybe hold there and come back to questions if there are. Yeah. I mean, there's like 400 pages, so there's a lot I could say, but I think for now that's I'll leave the space for questions, and yeah.
Thanks, Asher. I mean, just to say, going from these starts way before the 1960s and goes way beyond that. So it's actually quite short considering everything that's in it. So Thank you. I'm going to very quickly show you the last kind of publication, which is a piece about the Namibian Review, which the key editors of the Namibian Review were Ottilie Abrams and Kenneth Abrams, but Neville was very involved as well. And there was the Namibian Review, which was published for about a decade, starting in exile in Sweden and then translocated back to Namibia in the 1980s. So Asher and I have been kind of digging up these editions for a long time and working through them with Moshanja in lots of different ways, which is in the write-up that we're going to share. But it also includes some of the writing of Neville's. There was the Namibian Review publications, which was separate from the Namibian Review Journal. And I think it's got one of the best histories of Namibia written by Neville in that first edition about Jacob Marengo. Thank you. And the earliest resistance to German land occupation. So this is part of this digital teaching tool where you will find this piece is part of a bigger project that I work on with two other people called Revolutionary Papers. And the Revolutionary Papers project is about looking at anti-colonial movement materials, mostly movement publications. So journals, newsletters, serialized written communication from within movements, revolutionary movements. And I know we can debate what that means, but always in this case, it's not the ANC, it's not the PAC. These are organizations that had a lot more of a radical and expansive view of what should happen. And the Namibian Review is interesting in that it was imagined as a place to debate and imagine what life in Namibia would look like post independence. And it was intended to be non-sectarian in a similar way to how Sackhead and Neville worked. And so you can go to the Revolutionary Papers project, and there's a section on teaching tools, and there's lots from all over the world, from Cuba, from Sri Lanka, from Balochistan, from Palestine, from Kenya, and this is just one of them. And so it starts off, and what you can do with these teaching tools is hover over particular things. So you'll see where it says Kenneth and Ottilie Abrams, and then there's like a pop-up. Here's the Yuchi Chan Club, and then there'll be a pop-up. So they're laid out like that in order to be interactive and to be able to be used in classrooms and in movement education spaces. And so I'm not going to read from the Namibian Review, but I'll just slowly go through so you get a sense. We've put all of the covers so you can actually see every single article that was written by the titles, and you can kind of click through and see all of the editions almost all of the editions over a decade. But we were also interested in not what was just in these publications, but how did they circulate? Where did they circulate? And so some of that information we found out by looking at things like the sticker labels, which Asher found in a big container of Ottilie and Kenneth Abrams' stuff in Windhoek, letters that were written to the editor from, all over the place. So, this is pre-social media times of how did this communication work? And then how does it enable us to link various movements and different organizations over time? So starting to piece together very different histories, as Noor was pointing out, that Asher's thesis does. So in this Namibian Review publication, you can see here, it's 3 essays on Namibian history by Neville Alexander, and they're all in there. The second half of this teaching tool is about living histories of radical study practices. And that's where we talk about some of the work that Neville initiated, like the Know Your Continent African History sessions, how we've been working for, I guess, almost a decade now on new experiments of that kind of popular political education. And so we've put up 2 kind of resources there. One is called Radical Histories 1, SACED and some others. And this we actually presented at this conference, I think in 2017. But it's a long timeline of SACED. On the bottom of the timeline, it has conservative moves in education, and above it, it has radical moves in education. And it goes all the way into the future. So this was written in 2017, and the future was 2024, when a radical education collective had taken over the curriculum department for all of Southern Africa. So it's kind of funny now that it goes to 2024, but we're in 2024. But at the time, it went into the future. So we'll have to expand it. But as you can see, there's just little bite-sized pieces about different SACED projects. And at that time, there was very little that had been written about SACED. So to try to find out small snippets of things that we felt needed to have much deeper, longer studies into. So you can see a little write-up about Yuchi Chan Club, the newspaper projects, Jacob Marengo School, etc. So it goes on, with a whole section at the end of like what's missing on the map, what's going on. And what was great about that was once we put it out, we also then did start to get feedback from people who had been involved in SACED over a long period of time of things that could be added. We also had a little blurb about Upbeat magazine, and since then have been diving into more of that collection. And there's an interactive history bingo game that you can download and play in any session. And the second one is called Radical Histories 2, Ottilie Abrams Speaks. And this is a life map of Ottilie Abrams' political life history. And so it's a map of about 50 different things she was involved with. Going across her whole entire life history, which I won't go into now. It's so tempting, but I won't, including her relationship to SACED and the work that she was involved with Neville from the 1960s onwards. And so you can also download this as an interactive kind of curriculum. And we've been doing it at the school as well. There's Mushanja and I painting on the wall at the school. But there's a lot of resources in there about this history, and it's really also just a kind of scaffolding that needs a lot more work. But then what's the balance between doing the research and the thinking and then using it in practice and then kind of going back and forth? So it'll probably take the next decade to get further on it when we're trying to do everything at the same time. I'm going to open it up to questions now. I think we have... We're going to take only one round of questions and then hand it over to Leanne for the kind of final closing and other comments that people had wanted to make earlier on. So one round of questions and then something from each of our speakers, and then we'll be able to finish up. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so 1 minute questions. That's 5 minutes of questions.
Apologies, I'm not sure whether I should speak now because my question is directed to the previous speaker.
Okay, so this is just for this panel. Is that fine?
Yeah, thank you once again to Comrade Marcus. I had the opportunity of meeting Neville Alexander's colleagues on Robben Island, Sadiq Isaacs, Ahmad Kasim. I think you can recall now, I see you laughing or smiling, and also Abdurrahman, and I've interacted a lot with him. But what is important for me is basically what I'm drawing from this, is that there's a lot not being said in terms of resistance and struggle. Basically, the narrative only runs through the ANC reports and things like that. It's not amplified in terms of what we know. Early on in the discussion in this hall, there was a disconnect indicated that the youth of today don't know about the history of Robben Island, what happened on Robben Island, and how people took up a collective responsibility to challenge the apartheid regime and how we brought it down. And maybe if you could possibly just say a little bit about those colleagues, I would really, really appreciate it. And also how we can make use of your oral history, because that is very important. That must go into our history books. Meaning that what we know now is about Eurocentric Jan van Riebeeck and all that nonsense. we would like to know from you. And I would recommend that we give that to the Department of Education to put it into our history books, because that is us, not other people, us, indigenous people. Thank you. Can you just say a little bit about?
Okay, thank you. That's a really important question. And we can also stay here till 10 tonight. It's fine. Kelly.
So it's just a deep appreciation for the history nerds. Yeah, it's just such beautiful work that you're doing. Question really, though, is, I also know that all of you have very deep commitments to organizing, and that history work takes a lot of time. And I'm wondering if you can tell us, each of you, just briefly, what is the most important connection for you about doing this deep careful historical work, and the possibility that it opens for organizing and future-oriented planning. So can you explain to us, what is it for each of you that really captures that relationship?
Mersha?
So thanks to the panel. It was great to listen to you all. My question is just a little bit to Marcus and Asher, if it comes through in Marcus's document. He speaks about the last phase of SACED and how the impact of the changes in the country influences what goes on in SACED. But there's another moment prior to that, an earlier moment, when the ANC rises from exile and it comes back into the country and becomes dominant, and the role of the Freedom Charter is pushed across this country, and some of us get fired from our jobs, Salim and others, and LACOM comes under real pressure. And you again, the dialect, this relationship between the context, political education, the labor movement, and sectarianism, and the fear of the left who are not in the ANC. Perhaps you can just comment on that, because that was a big part of LACOM's and SACED's history, particularly the Western Cape.
I think there was a hand there, Selby's hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, comrades. The point that Comrade Mersha made there links up with the introduction in Comrade Neville's book, 8 years into post-apartheid South Africa, an ordinary country, where it states that to understand how we landed up in the current South Africa, in the post-apartheid South Africa, people or groups of people would have to write their own histories as to where were they at particular moments in the transition from apartheid to a one person, one vote system. So I'd like to say thank you to the people who put this together, because this is very important in terms of the political education, in terms of the history going forward. Growing up, we read, there were books that the apartheid government did and distributed, but they were not part of the curriculum. But they were part of the propaganda wars that they were conducting in the Southern African region. There was a book called Roko de Wet, the Grensvechter. Roko de Wet, the border fighter. So Roko de Wet was so strong, he would deal with all the terrorists that were coming into Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. He would kill all of them, even the Cubans. He was with the South African Defense Force. Now, reading that material, you would get an image, a mental image of how a terrorist looks like. And in my mind, a terrorist was someone who was tall, dark, with with red eyes. But when I met Marcus and Comrade Neville, I mean, they were in Robben Island. That's where the terrorists were placed. It was none of that. So it is important that this material needs to be collected and find a way of making it available to the young people, and that we move away from the trap that we've been put in, being told that, look, you know nothing, they are on TikTok, leave them, they are on TikTok and on social media and Facebook. No, that's false. There's only another medium of transmitting information and resources. So we need to find a way of getting that material, as Comrade Noor pleaded with Comrade Asha, that it should not gather dust on the archives of words, for the simple reason that not all of us got money for data to download, and we don't have the technologies. So means should be found to make this popularly available. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that, did I catch, was there any other burning hand that I had? Okay, great. All right, so we're just going to take a minute or two for each of the panelists to respond to anything that they want to or can, and then we will wrap up for the next session. I'll go in this order so that Uncle Marcus has the last word.
So very quickly in response to Kelly, because it's a long answer, right? But I would say that it's about challenging hegemony and trying to create counter hegemonic politics and practices. And for me, undertaking historical research, being involved in archiving, and making available and accessible the knowledge that is produced, and ideally co-produced with people who make history, is really an important part of that counter-hegemonic project. It's you're amplifying me. But anyway, that's my short answer. Yeah, this is a much longer answer, but that's it. Yeah.
I was hoping you were going to take a bit longer. But I was just opening Marcus's thesis to try and find a section to point you to, Comrade Mersha. But that's very much one of the dynamics that Marcus writes about. I mean, it's worth noting that the project was probably 60 to 70% done at the time, that in the form that it was. So a lot of things were slightly unfinished, but there's traces of those conversations and others in it. And you can find that in there. That's definitely one of the dynamics shaping, particularly that period from, I think he said 85 to the end of the 80s in his work. Yeah. And then, Kelly, that's a really big question, and hopefully we can discuss it for many years to come. I think maybe I can answer in a specific at the level of some of the things I've taken personally from the process of getting to interview old radicals and kind of sit with this work. I think it's one of the things that's given me is like an appreciation for contradiction and conflict, and a particular kind of orientation toward it. Like thinking about the long, slow work and what that kind of takes, and what a sort of yeah, I guess this thing of like contradiction and just seeing like how certain things break apart in certain moments, and wondering like what might another orientation have been in some of those conflicts. And I think also the idea of like that one of the, I think, important things that comes out of this work is, I mean, not just this work, but a broader kind of political tradition, is being able to identify antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions, and understanding that amongst comrades, a lot of contradictions that might feel at a certain point like really, really crucial, like, maybe your interpretation of the Soviets in the kind of post-revolutionary period differs to mine, and at a certain moment, in certain left groups, that has been like the cause for a split. But I think kind of trying to figure out, is that an antagonistic difference, or is it that, like, does it matter in the kind of process of organizing together? And I mean, that's kind of, I'm making trivial what has been an interesting debate. But I think that kind of idea around what is an antagonistic and what is a non-antagonistic difference has been one of the kind of principles or values or questions that I'm taking with me, and being able to identify those in amongst comrades.
I've noted all the questions. May I start with I think it was Kelly. I just want to make a point that, and I'm on record, if you want to know the history of Robben Island, don't ask only one person. In the section where I lived, we had more from 1,500 to 12,000 people passing through the gates of the island, all males, by the way. Yeah. I'm at a certain age, I've been around for 65 years in struggles, politics, whatever, and I've got a certain view. And I've always said, especially nowadays, when so many of the people who I've lived with and acted with have passed on, I've given a certain color. So you must verify what I say. But it's not only about people who are on the island, and I'm again on record. The people who suffered most were the families of those comrades were there. The wives, the parents, the dependents. But I also want to say that on the issue of writing history, people's history, I don't think we must be very careful how we fall into the opposite of what the ANC and the victors are doing. Hegemonic history. We can also do the same thing. It's very difficult. The history of the civic movement, the labor movement, the sports organization, the faith organization must still be written in this country from a Batila's historical perspective. Yeah? It must still be done. But we write about individuals, etc., etc. What Ash has done, and for the first time I read something, and I'll be as open as possible without being antagonistic. But if so be it, the history of this Cape Peninsula Students' Union. In fact, when I asked this Asher, what prompted me, and explained it very well, there was something about this ongoing continuity process. Now, even that process, but I had an international context. There was a split in the socialist movement in 1924, and it got to be known as the Trotskyist and the Stalinist. It wasn't just, in fact, on the island, do you know a chap called Harry Gwala? No, I immigrated to him. No, Harry was he called himself the last Stalinist on the planet. But Harry had the blood of the working class in this country. You know what Harry did? He took on Nkata. Well, I shouldn't say he. if it wasn't for Harry and what he started, they would have slaughtered the UEF, the ANC, etc. Now, the point I want to make is, I'm going to speak about not now, the resistance. The resistance, before I go there, you're involved in struggle, not to liberate other people, you involve the struggle to liberate yourself. It's an ongoing movement for the rest of your life. You've never arrived until you are carried to the kubus or the graveyard or wherever you go to the cremation. And you can only, there's always that legacy of 400-500 years of triarchy, sexism, whatever. So the thing is, the resistance, the stay on the island was about massive people, and that history has not been written yet. In fact, I've been told people, when we discuss with the researchers on the island, that history has not been written. There were thousands of people, the interpreters, the soul writers, the history of the sports. And when some of these old comrades told us, guys, don't come and lose your temper here. We're in a long struggle here. Yeah? Take your time, watch. So, and it's about, we learned so much from the older comrades. Yeah? So the thing, and so there was a point, so the thing about especially from the Eastern Cape, the majority of the comrades were from the Eastern Cape. And they were, most of them never passed in at 6. But they've been in the treason trial. They did the what they call the footwork for the formation or the put together of the Freedom Charter. And then of course the history of the Freedom Charter became the history of a few. 10,000 volunteers. And some of them were there, and we learned a lot about how you find out how a people's charter is put together. So the history of resistance is very important. But don't ask me, I can give you this thing. And we must do it quickly. Because because the comrades are dying. Yeah? They are dying. And so most of them are gone. And they led that resistance. Because they be working on the mine, 1946 mines, the comrades were in the 1946 strike of the mines. And how they dealt with it. Time. Oh, sorry. I'm on the road.
Okay, Marcus, we got to end soon.
So it's not about, and there is a history about all sorts of things. But it was the resistance came from Mama, the women of our comrades. They sustained them. They can say what they want to. Oh yes, this is my last point. When you're involved in struggle, you're not a victim because you're a conscious agent. You're a casualty of struggle. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's give a big hand of applause to all of our panel. Thank you.
Okay, please do not get up. Yunus, Omar, and Salim Bali, quickly we need to thank some people. Otherwise today wouldn't have been possible. So please stay with us for a few more minutes. Thank you to the radical historians and the Walking Archive. That was fantastic. Yunus, we want to go for this.
Go. Thanks. There's just a very important question that Leanne needs to pose to one of our audience members, one of our colleagues here, and then we'll commence with this one. Thanks. Thanks very much. It's my very pleasurable duty to extend the vote of thanks to a number of people here. Before we do that, I do want to say that I was very moved this morning when people did the remembrances, and I think we ought to just commit ourselves to a moment of silence in which we reflect on those who we have lost and who globally have been lost in moments of savagery that I haven't experienced before, certainly not in my lifetime. So if we can just commit to that. Thanks. Thank you. The vote of thanks, there are a number of people, and I do declare upfront that if I do miss out anybody, please do accept my apologies. This does not reflect on the head of department of the School of Education, Professor Azim Badruddin, or Professor Joanne Hardman. I'm supposed to be doing the job, and if I fail, it's no reflection on them. The first person to thank is sitting on my right-hand side here, Professor Salim Vali, the Research Chair in Community, Adult and Worker Education, Kawe, at the University of Johannesburg. It's through their generosity that we've got numbers of people, along with the second person that we will thank here in the organization. We have them to thank for the attendance of people from very far. And so thank you very much for that generosity from the chair. We also want to thank the South African Country Director of DVV International, Farrell Hunter. Farrell, where are you? If you can just indicate where you are. Farrell Hunter, thank you very much. Again, it's through the generosity of these two organizations that we are able to have our comrades here from up north. The University of Cape Town is the lucky recipient of their generosity. Basically, we've provided a venue. So thank you very much. I want to acknowledge that very, very clearly here. The Cape Town Organizing Committee asked me not to mention their names, so I will not mention Leanne Naidu. I will not mention Kholisa Guzula, so that I do not fall foul of that at all. And Leanne Naidu asked me not to do this, so I'm definitely not going to say that we want to thank Leanne Naidu for going beyond the task of holding the day together for us. Leanne, you set an inspirational example to us all. Thank you. From the organizers from up north, I want to thank Mpumi Thebokulu, a CERT organizing stalwart who put together in very, very quick time, a number of weeks, fantastic set of organization things and administrative tasks to get everybody here. Thank you very much. From our Cape Town side, Lita Tulu. Lita, are you around? There we go. Thank you, Lita. You worked with Pumi to get this all done. Thank you, Lita. From our side, Virginia Mgangato. Virginia, are you around? People who've set up the building for us, who've organized the building for us in ways that are quite invisible. Thank you very much. And then Teresa Valentine, also from UCT, thank you very much for the sterling work that you've done. It does not go unnoticed, and we are thankful for that. Thank you very much. To our chairs and panelists, a warm thank you for leading our engagements today and for leaving us with questions and ideas to grapple with when we leave in the best Brechtian sense. To all attendees, all of you, here and online, who honored us and honored the 14th Annual Neville Alexander Conference, thank you for making today a vibrant, supportive, and critical space to be in. Thank you very much. Please give ourselves a warm hand of applause here. Thank you. From my side, we look ahead to renewed thinking and acting to change the world in the best ways of good revolutionaries. From my side, thank you very much. Go well and travel in safety. I'd like to hand over to Professor Salim Vali to conclude. Thank you.
My job is very, very simple, and it's just to thank Eunice for thanking all of you, presenters and chairs and people who traveled, provided the space, Eunice and Azim. When I look around, Neville had this phrase, people who are steeled in struggle. And there are so many people here doing incredible work. And sometimes we forget that. There are struggles happening throughout the country. Whether it's e-hailing workers Umar, another stalwart with us for a long time. Mazibuko, I'm not sure if he's still here, doing work in the Eastern Cape. There are even people doing work in faith-based organizations, very important work amongst students, amongst academics, various social movements. Soraya has just left, but in the trade union movement as well, some struggles we win, some struggles we lose temporarily, but we continue because the battle continues. And capitalism, in whatever form, cannot solve the problems people are confronting. In fact, as we see, it's exacerbating the problems: poverty, inequality, thank you, social injustice, discrimination of all sorts, xenophobia. All of this continues. It has no answers, but we can only tackle those problems successfully if we get organized, if we link those struggles. So you don't need to be a gay person to fight against homophobia. You don't need to be a migrant worker to fight against xenophobia. You don't need to be a woman to fight against patriarchy, etc. So I think the issue is to combine the struggles, to identify the main enemy, to debate our issues, to allow people maximum space to be creative. And I think that there are many things that will happen in the near future. The extreme right wing is running rampant throughout the world, and we are not immune from that. There is very little difference in the rhetoric of Trump or of Gayton McKenzie. And Gayton McKenzie is winning support, and they're using state structures, and many of them have the resources. So I think we have lots of work in front of us. Normally, when we come to the end of the Neville Alexander Conference, and we have all these rich discussions, these debates, the literature people are producing, and there's an emptiness. Okay, well, how do we go forward? It's always a conundrum. All we can say is that this provides a space for people to get to know what we all doing, to link up after this conference ends, not to wait for another year, to share ideas and to strengthen each other. I can't compete with Marcus. I think he really had the final word, very eloquently, passionately expressed. And I think very importantly, the point has been made by a number of speakers that we do need to return to the source. Neville, again paraphrasing Amilcar Cabral, the things that animated us need to continue to animate us because we haven't addressed the root causes of those issues. We've become wiser, and the whole question of sectarianism is a scourge. It weakens us. That doesn't mean we mustn't clarify our views, our principles, call people out who get co-opted, who go to the other side. And in the trade union movement, the civic movement, there have been many people like that. So that compass we have that has been provided by our revolutionary ancestors continues to be a compass, continues to inspire us. This doesn't mean that young people don't educate us. They do. there's different contexts. They have access to resources we never had. But I think what we're talking about, Asher, is the dialectic that has to have soul. The dialectic that we learn from each other, and together we have some kind of synthesis, and to link up with struggles around the world. At this moment, the genocide, there's a particular meaning for the left or socialists or progressives around the world. It's also a litmus test. It also has shown the bankruptcy of liberalism, of neoliberalism as well. And once again, there are opportunities, there are terrible risks as Palestinians are finding out, as people in the Congo, in Sudan, and elsewhere. But I think that we should not lose hope, that we are many. If we consider people involved in struggle who might not have the vocabulary as people were talking about, they might not have the language to understand or to explain, but they have the will. They know that what they are confronting is inequality, injustice, and I think we have a role to play together with those people. And I just think that we have a huge problem in the face of global fascism, and it's real, but there are so many possibilities to fight back. And, you know, one of the leaders of the resistance, the Palestinian resistance, Sinwar, who was killed, and his final act, although he lost an arm and he was dying, his final act was to use a stick and throw it against that quadcopter, in the same way that Rifat al-Hariri said, if the Israelis come in here, I don't have any arms, I'm a professor, I'm a writer, I'm a poet, but I will use whatever I have to throw it at the Israeli soldier. And he talks about an expo marker. And so the phrase Sinwar stick has become part of the language, that despite overwhelming odds, you resist, you continue to resist, you don't give up hope. At the moment, there are many actions planned, and Riyadh has reminded me there are people who've gone to Richards Bay to stop the coal from getting to Israel. There are actions with people in other coastal areas, and we really want comrades in Cape Town as well. I know there are groups thinking about this, but in this way, the Palestinian struggle enriches and deepens our own struggle, and that's the spirit of internationalism. So I'm going to stop there. I can go on, but it's 7:10. So please remember, we need to contact each other, communicate with each other. There are lots of plans we don't have the time to go into, but thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next year as well.
Thank you, Salim. Two things to remind you of. Firstly, a huge oversight. Let us please thank Tseho Khole, who kept us connected to the outside and did all the things on very short notice. And then the SACED Archive Project, comrades have asked me to remind you there is a website live. Go and see it. There's resources there and revolutionary papers as well. Travel safely. Thank you so much. See you next year.